Gender Studies 100, lecture number 3 on second wave feminism. Before you watch this lecture, you should have done all of the assigned readings for this day in the Feminist Theory book, and you should have your Feminist Theory book with you because I'm going to ask you to look up some things in the readings. Let's start by talking about reading theory. I often tell people that theory is easiest to read with a glass of wine. Now, I'm not trying to encourage underage drinking, but the reason that I say that is that when you start reading theory, most of us seize up at some point. You read and you realize that you're not understanding a particular sentence or a particular paragraph, so you read it over again, and you still don't understand it. So you read it over again, and by the time you get that sentence, you've forgotten what the previous sentence was about, you've forgotten what the previous paragraph was about, and you've totally lost the flow of the theory. That little glass of wine stops that panicky feeling and lets you just relax and read all the way through the theory. Now, you can do this without a glass of wine. All you have to do is start by just reading the piece. Just read the article. If you don't understand a sentence, don't worry about it. Keep reading. Look for some of the key terms in the article. What keeps coming up over and over again? What do you think is important in the article? Is there a relationship between the terms? What do you think are the main points of the article? You may have to go all the way through it and just come up with what the key words are. That's okay. That's a good start. Then go back and read it a second time. Now that you've got the key words, can you figure out the main point? Can you figure out the relationship between the key terms and the main point? Are there any new key terms or ideas that you missed last time? So hard theory, you usually have to read through twice, but don't get stuck on individual sentences that you don't understand. What we're looking for is the overall point of the author, the main terms that are important, and how the terms and the overall point interact with each other. Okay, let's take a look at Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir is a figure in between first wave and second wave feminism. She's not a second wave feminist because second wave feminism starts a little later than the time that Beauvoir wrote. We may have talked last time about the dip that happened in the prominence of feminism, especially in the United States, between first wave and second wave. So what happens is you get to the end of first wave feminism in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and that has been the goal for feminism. So once they achieve that goal, even though there's a lot more to do in terms of the equality of women, the energy kind of dies out of the movement. And then World War II happens, the Great Depression happens first, and then World War II happens, and there are all of these other things going on. Women go to work quite a bit during World War II. But then when the men return from the war, there's a big movement to try to get women back into the house. Now, this is more for middle-class women and more for white women than it is for working-class women and women of color, who generally have to continue working outside the home, even though they're being told that the ideal is to be working in the home, caring for the children, caring for your husband, and so on. So this strong movement to push women back into the home, or at least to create an ideal of women being in the home, really affects feminism as well. I'll talk a little bit later about the rise of second wave feminism, what started that. But know that Simone de Beauvoir is writing in this interim period, in between first wave and second wave feminism. So she writes this book called The Second Sex. You read a section of the introduction to that book. It's written in French in 1949. Beauvoir was French, and was translated into English and published in English in 1952. The basis for her work in The Second Sex is the philosophical school of thought known as existentialism. The main proponent of existentialism is Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir was partners, not just business partners, but partners, lovers with Sartre. So she was very much part of the existentialist school as well. What's important for existentialism is, at least as far as it relates to what Beauvoir is writing about in terms of the equality of women, is the concept of transcendence. So take out your feminist theory reader and let's take a look at a couple of passages. On page 41, Beauvoir briefly describes transcendence. She says, and I'm 6 lines down from the top. She says, every subject plays his part as such, specifically through exploits or projects, are you following me, that serve as a mode of transcendence. He achieves liberty only through a continual reaching out toward other liberties. So this is a kind of self-transcendence. This is the idea that you can move beyond your current place in life. You can reach beyond it and move yourself to new levels of freedom, to new levels of thought. Where do we want to go from here? So the relevance of this concept of transcendence for women is that they're often not allowed to, by society, to achieve this sort of transcendence. So we find women striving to transcend and yet being blocked. So take a look again at page 41, and now I'm at the beginning of the second full paragraph on the page. She says, now what peculiarly signalizes the situation of women is that she, a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, and this is important for existentialism, the idea that humans are born free and autonomous, and that any imposition of restrictions on that freedom and autonomy is a form of oppression, because it prevents that transcendence that we were just talking about. She says that woman nevertheless finds herself living in a world where men compel her to assume the status of the other. Notice that capital O in other. This is a very important concept that comes from Beauvoir, but that is used in feminist discourse, that is feminist dialogue and discussion. Currently has been used for a long period of time. So what it essentially means is that we can distinguish between the concept of self and the concept of other with a capital O. The other is that against which the self defines itself. So we might say that part of how we define ourselves as people is we know that I am like this and not like that. So the like that becomes the other against which we define ourselves. When we're talking about the level of society, then that other becomes a capital O. So there are dominant groups in society, groups that hold social power, that define themselves over against other groups. In the case that Beauvoir is talking about, we have men as a group. We're not talking about individual men here being oppressive. This is not about all men being awful towards women, but rather about the ways that social power works. So men as a group become defined in our society over against women as the other, as the non-dominant group. And notice that that leaves women without a self, without a sense of self. So that, again, is preventing the transcendence that Beauvoir is talking about. We can use this concept in other ways as well. So we can talk, for instance, about race in our society. Whites would be the self, and again, we're not talking about individual white people, but rather how society defines white people as a group. As the dominant race in our country, whites become the self, and people of color become the other. Again, without a self, without that same ability to transcend. And in fact, we see early theorists of racial justice using the same basis in existentialism to argue for racial equality. We can make the same kinds of points in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of class, in terms of disability, and other forms of social power and inequality. So there's the concept of transcendence, there's existentialism, and how it applies to women. let's take a look at Beauvoir's understanding of women. So think for a minute about what a woman is for Beauvoir. You might want to go back and look in your text. Now, what about the relationship between women and men for Beauvoir? I think we can go back to the text again here. The relationship between women and men is social for Beauvoir. So this is not a writer who sees women as essentially certain ways. Unlike the first wave feminists that we studied last time, Beauvoir understands women to be a social creation. She says elsewhere, it's not in our reading, but it's a very important quotation from Beauvoir, that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So think about what that means for a minute. It's not just girls grow up to be women. It's that one is born a human, but one learns to be or becomes a woman. And the relationship then between women and men is also something that becomes, that comes to be. This makes Beauvoir one of the earliest constructivists. There's a difference in feminist theory between constructivism and essentialism. If you write those two words out, you can see, and you can see on the screen here, the word construct in constructivism, or construct, which is the noun, and the word essence in essentialism. So somebody who is an essentialist theorist believes that, especially when we're talking about gender, although it can be applied in other contexts too, like race, somebody who is an essentialist when it comes to gender believes that women and men are the way they are because of something innate, an essence, something about who they are innately makes them women, makes them men. There are biological essentialists who believe that women are the way they are because of hormones, because of genetics, and that men are the way they are for the same reason. We hear a lot of biological essentialism in popular culture. People talk about estrogen and how it affects women. Women are nurturing because of their hormones, because they're made to have babies. We talk about men having testosterone and being aggressive because of their testosterone and being tough and manly because of their testosterone. That's an essentialist argument. Constructivists, on the other hand, argue that gender is a construct. Gender is a social creation. Let me go back to essentialism for just a minute. There's a sort of intermediate step in between biological essentialism and constructivism, and that is psychological essentialism. That argument is that people are born just people, but their experiences in terms of their relationship to their parents, especially to the mother, as they discover either that their bodies are the same as their mothers or different from their mothers, affects how they develop and therefore affects gender. So this still makes gender an essence, and it's still a form of essentialism, but it doesn't see it as inborn, it rather sees it as sort of trained in very early on. Okay, we will see eventually a form of constructivism that not only argues that gender is a construct, but that biological sex is too. Beauvoir is not going to go there. Beauvoir is just going to say, we're born as human beings, we become our gender. So, Beauvoir has an argument about the beginnings of first wave feminism. Let's take a look at that briefly on pages 37 to 38. And here I'm on the very last line of 37. She says, one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, so remember this is 19th century, was the entrance of women into productive labor. And it was just here that the claims of the feminist emerged from the realm of theory, that would be Wollstonecraft, for instance, and acquired an economic basis while their opponents became the more aggressive. Do you hear the echoes of Marx in here? Beauvoir is also very influenced by Marx. So, here's this situation. We have women as the other, we have men as the self, we have women repressed in their ability to self-transcend, restricted by gender norms, whereas men can, at least white men, at least middle-class men, can reach beyond themselves, can work towards that form of self-transcendence. Why doesn't anybody change this? This is the really important question for Beauvoir. Like it was for Marx, if you remember your readings in Marx, if you've read him yet. Marx was very concerned about why the proletariat wasn't rising up against the bourgeoisie in the way that he expected them to. And that was a big concern for a lot of Marxists, and still is to a certain extent. So let's take a look back at page 37. And here, I'm in the middle of the page. Beauvoir says that the reason that women don't change their situation is this. To decline to be the other, again, here's that capital O, to refuse to be a party to the deal, would be for women to renounce the advantages conferred upon them by their alliance with the superior caste. There are rewards for following the gender norms, for not resisting. Man the sovereign will provide woman the liege, that means the not quite servant, but the follower, with material protection. In other words, in the traditional mid-20th century version of the family, the man was the breadwinner. So he protected the woman, he brought in the money, he supported the family. She didn't have to go out and work if she didn't want to. She could take care of the kids if she wanted to. And will undertake the moral justification of her existence. So he's doing the intellectual work as well. He's doing the self-transcendence, but he's also doing the intellectual work to convince both himself and her that her place is in fact in the home. She can evade at once both economic risk, in other words, she's being supported by somebody else, and the metaphysical risk of a liberty in which ends and aims must be contrived without assistance. In other words, it can be kind of a relief not to have to think for yourself. Indeed, along with the ethical urge of each individual to affirm his subjective existence, there is also the temptation to forego liberty and become a thing. It's easier not to self-transcend. So there are advantages to being the other, especially in the gender system of the mid-20th century West. Now, men also have advantages. So take a look at page 38 at the very bottom. She's talking about men now, and she says they cannot be blamed for not cheerfully relinquishing all the benefits they derive from the myth. This is the myth of women's inferiority. For they realize what they would lose in relinquishing woman as they fancy her to be, while they fail to realize what they have to gain from the woman of tomorrow. So men get rewards too from this gender system. So both men and women are being rewarded by a gender system that keeps women subordinate. And therefore, in the mid-20th century, remember that's when Beauvoir is writing, and therefore, nobody is changing the situation. We'll see in a minute that that changes too. So, that's Simone de Beauvoir. Take a minute to write down any questions you have about her, and I'll try to answer them when I get back. Okay, let's go on to talk about second wave feminism. So again, remember, Beauvoir is not a second wave feminist, but her writing becomes, she is a feminist. She's writing in between first wave and second wave. Her writing becomes incredibly influential for the second wave of feminism. So this begins approximately in the mid-1960s, and we continue it up until approximately the late 1980s, and we'll talk later about some of the reasons why second wave feminism gave way to third wave feminism. So some of the factors in the rise of second wave feminism. Gender roles. Again, for some, so this nuclear family with the mom working at home with kids and the dad working out of the home and being the breadwinner, is a model that was followed primarily by the white middle class. It was a model that was held up as an ideal for people of color and for working class women of all races, but it was much less attainable for them. So imagine what that's like, to have this ideal of womanhood that you can never quite get to. This is going to be the source of some of the tensions in second wave feminism between white feminists and feminists of color. So for some people, these gender roles involving being in the home, raising the kids, being a part of the PTA, not being able to go work, some women found it very restrictive, some women found it stifling. In 1963, a woman named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. What it talks about is the same myth of femininity that Beauvoir is talking about. The idea that women are made to be in the home, that women enjoy just being home and raising children. And again, that this is all women. There are certainly some women who do enjoy just being at home and raising children. But Friedan was arguing that's not true for all women, and so women shouldn't be forced to just stay home, to just take care of the children. She basically makes an argument that women are not what they're held up to be by society. She tries to undermine the feminist mystique. She tries to undermine the myth of what it is to be a woman. Many women read this and found it changed their lives. So this was an extraordinarily influential book. Betty Friedan went on to become a very important feminist leader. Also in the 1960s, we've got several other very prominent activist movements going on. The civil rights movement has been going on since at least the 1940s and has reached a peak in the 1960s. The peace movement is going on. Other kinds of rights movements for people of color are going on. And we've got a couple of different branches in those rights movements. So we've got, in most of the rights movements, what we would call a liberal branch that is trying to work within society to create change, and a radical branch that thinks that society as a whole needs to change in order for justice to be done. In many cases, the radical branch ends up making the liberal branch look a little more safe to the people that aren't part of the movements, and so the liberal branch ends up getting a lot done because the radical branch looks so scary. So they work together very nicely, even though that's not the purpose. We'll see that some of the same dynamics happen in the context of second wave feminism. So one of the other interesting things about these rights movements is that on the one hand they serve as inspiration for feminism, and the feminist movement draws a lot of its work, a lot of its strategies from these other rights movements. On the other hand, women are running into sexism in these rights movements. So women involved in the peace movement, women involved in leftist activism, women involved in the civil rights movement are coming to meetings ready to start planning civil action, ready to start leafleting, and they're asked to go make coffee. They're asked to go photocopy flyers. And they start to resent this. And so they take all the strategies that they've learned and they go to the feminist movement and really enliven it. And that's part of what gets the feminist movement going right off the ground. So in closing, I'd like you to be thinking about the themes that you've seen so far in the readings for second wave feminism. What are some of the things that are important to second wave feminists? How do they see women? What do they understand a woman to be? What do they understand women's oppression to be like? Where do they think it comes from? And what do they think the priorities of the women's movement ought to be? All of those are important themes that we can talk about when I get back. Okay, finally, I want you to be thinking about these questions that I have up here. Again, These lecture outlines are on Clio, so you can find the questions. You don't have to write them down right now. What is the nature of women's oppression? What are its causes and solutions? And what does it mean to be a feminist anyway, or a womanist in the case of Alice Walker's writing? Reading questions for next time. Write these down or get them off of Clio. What is epistemology? You might want to look it up. I recommend the Oxford English Dictionary, which you can get to through Penrose, through the Penrose website. According to each of the authors that you're reading for next time, how do people know things? Do women know differently from men? And if so, how? And then finally, what do you think of these authors' ideas? Okay, that's it for this lecture. Thanks for watching.